So, hello everyone, and welcome to the keynote talk of the Irish Association for American Studies annual conference, the Alan Graham Memorial Lecture 2022. My name is Catherine Gander, and I'm the chair of the IAAS, and it gives me great pleasure to be introducing Professor Joy Porter this evening as our esteemed guest speaker. Before we hear Professor Porter's talk, I'd like to thank Dublin City University's School of English, in particular, Dr. Michael Hines and his conference team, which I know consisted mainly of Dr. Michael Hines, for putting together such a rich and inspiring program. I was just saying earlier to Jory, we've been here, the first day was amazing. Every panel I went to was fantastic. It was generative of ideas, of engaged discussion. And the research that we've heard is really at the forefront of new research in American studies. So American studies is in safe hands on the island of Ireland. I'd also like to thank Professor Porter for agreeing to join us for this conference. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and the delegates for sharing their research with us. I'd like to thank the people who are helping behind the scenes. So Thomas, thank you for that. And special thank yous also go to Sarah McCready, Tim Groenland, Carolyn Schroeter, and Kate Farmer for always going the extra mile for the IAAS. I really do appreciate it. A reminder that this event is being recorded and that we ask you to keep your microphones muted at all times unless you're called on to ask a question in the Q&A portion of the talk. Professor Porter will talk for around 45 minutes or so, after which I will open the floor to questions. The whole event will last around an hour and 15 minutes. Please refrain from asking any questions in the chat or otherwise until I open up the floor for questions. Obviously, it would be quite distracting otherwise, so thank you for that. Okay, without further ado, Professor Joy Porter is PI of the Treated Spaces Research Group at the University of Hull, which coordinates a portfolio of externally funded research with the aim of making treaties and environmental concerns central to debates about disciplines, policy registers, and public discourse. She is a PI of the Brightening the Covenant Chain, the AHRC Standard Research Grant, is currently a Leverhulme Major Research Fellow, and is the lead editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Elements in Indigenous Environmental Research. I love the Elements series. Her most recent books are Trauma, Primitivism, and the First World War, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021, and Native American Environmentalism, which was published by University of Nebraska Press in 2014. Now, you can catch the collaborative exhibition that Joy and her group organized, featuring the work of Anishinaabe artist and researcher Celeste Pedri-Spade until July at the American Museum and Gardens in Bath, UK, and digitally via the Treated Spaces website. So I will put that in the chat later. You're all very welcome also to attend the upcoming hybrid all Indigenous webinar entitled Cultures of Diplomacy that Joy will be hosting on the 19th of May. So you can register again via the Treated Spaces website. Joy is also PI host 2020 to 2024 for British Academy Global Professor Gregory Smithers Project, Native Ecologies, Traditional Ecological Knowledge and Climate Change. This is a very impressive CV. She was born, as we've just been discussing, in Derry, in Northern Ireland, at the height of the Troubles. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why all of her research, all of her endeavors, all of her projects seem to be committed to sharing traditions of mutual respect, of sharing learning and intellectual generosity across cultural divides. Joy, we're absolutely honored to have you with us, albeit virtually, and we look forward to hearing your keynote talk for us today, which is titled Wildness and Indigenous American Futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really kind. And it's been lovely already just to hear voices from home and to meet you, Catherine. It's wonderful. And thank you, Michael, for your foresight in planning this conference, which I think is a brilliant idea at a brilliant time. So this talk is called Wildness and Indigenous American Futures. Essentially, it's saying that the way we've thought about the wild, right, I've just lost my script because of what Michael just did. There we go, that's fine, it's back. Essentially, it's saying that the idea of the wild is under fundamental transition as we embark on the fourth industrial revolution. And that has implications, very multivalent implications for the future. Profound unsettlement surrounding the concept comes at the same time as profound change across the world linked to various new technologies. We're rethinking how we understand wildness and relate to the associated concept wilderness, at the same time as there's a crisis in the wild, the extinction of what economists call the Earth's vital natural producers, or what you and I might call birds, amphibians, mammals, reptiles, and fish, each of which have declined 68% since 1970, according to the World Wildlife Fund. Aside from the species like that we might see every day, there's the additional aspect of biodiversity that until recently, no one's thought too much about: the single cell microbes that make up most of the organisms on Earth, the viruses, the bacteria, archaea, fungi, algae, and protozoa. These too are being profoundly affected as the recent COVID pandemic has brought home. The United Nations tells us that overall, we're on the brink of the 6th great extinction of species on Earth. And the fear is that we may be on or about to reach one or more environmental tipping point, whereupon cascades of further unanticipated environmental negative impacts ensue. Interestingly, amongst countries, the UK has one of the lowest amounts of biodiversity remaining. According to Andy Purvis and his team at the Natural History Museum, his group's created a biodiversity intactness index. The UK, the place where the Industrial Revolution was born, it's led the way in degrading the natural environment. It's got only half of its biodiversity left. The UK is at the bottom of countries globally for biodiversity. And if we look at all the countries in the EU, guess who comes out worse for biodiversity than the UK? Only Ireland and Malta. And of course, one of the biggest culprits there is intense agricultural farming. But of course, the issue is a worldwide problem, and it's sped up in particular in the 20th century. So it's perhaps inevitable that we must therefore re-examine our understanding and relationship to the idea of the wild as this new industrial fourth revolution, the coming age of the human-machine interaction begins. This is very likely to unsettle how we comprehend ourselves, others, machines, even perhaps reality itself. What do I mean by this fourth industrial revolution? Well, much of it is changes based on revolutions within what's called the green technologies: genetics, robotics, information, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology. So if we could have our second slide, please. Anytime now is good. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Nearly there. Let's go for the next slide. Thanks. Brilliant. According to Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, we're about to embark on a time when humans and machines are going to dance. There's going to be an increasingly intimate coexistence or enhanced existence with machines. So I'm talking cobots, collaborative robots, neurolinking, and personalization. And this is likely to affect every aspect of our lives. And the question we have to ask is, what happens to our sense of ourselves and of what is wild once we start routinely interacting with humanoids that are built algorithmically to give us what we want and give us more of what we've come to expect. And if I could ask Michael to just play this little video to give us a sense of what that future might be like. This is Amica. She's a humanoid robot, and she uses AI to learn what we might want. Have a look at her face and how she makes you feel. Consider how she makes you feel. So I'll really look forward to your opinions on that at the end. And briefly, if Michael could just play this little sci-fi feature film, which I urge you to look up and watch all of. It's called Slaughterbots. And that's the kind of not so pleasant end of this revolution. It is robotic warfare. And I gave a talk a while ago at in the United States in a military play, and they were talking very much about just this technology, swarm technology. So if you could press play, please, Michael, I'd be really kind.
Customer pilots directed almost 3,000 precision strikes last year. We're super proud of it. It allows you to separate the bad guys from the good. It's a big deal. But we have something much bigger. Your kids probably have one of these, right? Not quite. Hell of a pilot? No. That skill is all AI. It's flying itself. Its processor can react 100 times faster than a human. The stochastic motion is an anti-sniper feature. Just like any mobile device these days, it has cameras and sensors, and just like your phones and social media apps, it does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of shaped explosive. This is how it works. Did you see that?
Okay, if we can stop it there, please. And I'll leave you to
bang.
watch the rest of Slaughterbots, which is very disconcerting, I think you might find. So robotics are a concern, but perhaps it's the genetics revolution that's round the corner that is the one that's most obviously going to impact how we perceive and understand wilderness or nature. So what I'm going to talk briefly about is gene editing, or gain of function, as it's called. Now, since 2015, when CRISPR technology was developed, we became, as a species, able to relatively cheaply alter the genomes of species. Now we can actually bring versions of extinct species back to life. If we could maybe have the next slide, please, that would be kind. And we can transfer genes from one species to another. I'll probably just repeat that. We can transfer genes from one species to another, and we can bring extinct species back to life. That blows my mind. I don't know how you might feel about it. Given that, the question then arises, if we are prepared to alter evolution in this way, and we're doing it, what are animals? And what are we? And what is species conservation? And what is it, if we're conserving species, that we're conserving? Most of the gene editing of plants and animals, it's called synthetic biology, that's done today is done not for conservation purposes. Biotech is a huge industry set to grow at 16% a year up until 2050. Very American industry as well. It was worth $750 billion in 2020. Synthetic biology can make changes happen in a lab in a few months or days that evolution once brought about over many millions of years. And one example of a genetically altered species that was released into the wild is the diamond-backed moth. It was altered so that it was less resistant to pesticides, and it was released in 2017. So synthetic biology, it's got the potential to transform how we experience and understand the wild, and enormous potential also to change the balance of how we understand developed and developing countries. Think about, for example, what Africa might be like if a gene drive was done, so altered genetics so that it passes through the whole species, that maybe altered or got rid of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Third thing we might talk about is artificial intelligence. If we could have the next slide, please. And this is another mind blower. With artificial intelligence, it's the first time we've had on Earth an exponentially growing intelligence that rivals our own. And it's operating at a global scale, and it's capable of perceiving much more quickly than we can aspects of reality that we can't comprehend. It's possible that in a world in the future curated to us by artificial intelligence and superbly designed to stimulate us, that we may start to find other humans and animals disagreeable on a basic level, and we may, in a profoundly impactful way, lose the space in our lives for deep thought or analysis and contemplation. Of course, AI, like any technology, can be used for good or bad, and currently it is very impressively being used for conservation. Google Wildlife Insights uses AI. World Wildlife Fund is working with Intel to protect Siberian tigers. But AI, I think, has a profound future impact probably on how we'll understand the wild. So too will the new version of Facebook, metaverse, or the virtual reality world, however it's configured and whoever ultimately controls it. What is the metaverse? It's a highly tailored, seductive series of connected worlds full of avatars and holograms. One source says it's a $10 to $30 trillion opportunity over the next 10 to 15 years. And it's really interesting that Mark Zuckerberg's version of the metaverse is always one that's ecologically pristine, the beautiful world. However, in truth, the metaverse is likely to have a really negative environmental impact. The training of artificial intelligence models emits a lot of carbon dioxide, as does cloud computing. And this may well be something you want to consider when you're thinking about or pressured into by your children to buy avatars and virtual land, etc. Now, the question is, if we are seduced into virtual worlds, how much will we care for the wild, for the physical world and its creatures? How much will we care in an ever more stressful world where competition for resources continues to increase about the actual versus the digitally curated wild? Bear in mind that 1920 was when the United States had the largest number of horses. So it's only 100 years since every single American had daily contact with an animal. And how many of us today can say that? And I'm not thinking really about pets, who are a different thing really from animals in the wild as are conventionally understood. So there's enormous change happening in just that 100 years. If we could have our next slide, please. Finally, this fourth industrial revolution, big factor thing that's going to happen is nanotechnology. What's that? In essence, it's the manipulation of individual atoms and molecules at the nanometer levels. That's about 100,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. At that scale, you can improve the qualities of materials and do a lot of stuff that could help save the environment. But there is also a serious pollution risk if nanomaterials get released into the atmosphere. They're so minute that they can penetrate the cells of living organisms. And if they are polluting, this could make them really difficult to eradicate. For example, they can cross the blood-brain barrier. Basically, we just don't know what the impact of manufactured nanoparticles is on the environment or on ecosystems. There's a great writer called Bruno Latour, and he said, the future, we have to learn to love our monsters. And there's been a lot of interesting work on how with all this fourth industrial revolution work, the language used is dictating the form that the work is growing into. So there's a lot of language of editing, which is, is from writing, and talk of the book of DNA. And we also talk about a chassis within aspects of synthetic biology. So if you're interested in that, look at Jane Calvert's work from Edinburgh. So you've got engineering language, using language from other disciplines. I think this fourth industrial revolution puts the existing debates surrounding the wild as a concept into a completely new perspective. And you may be very familiar really with the American trajectory of thinking surrounding the idea of the wild. A lot of it, I think, can be traced back to Raymond Williams, the Welsh novelist and literary critic at Oxford. And he wrote this book, Problems of Materialism and Culture. And he made the basic vital point that nature, this thing called nature, isn't just out there. It's got a history, and ideas about nature are always reflections of what we feel is missing. They are, he said, the projected ideas of men. How we understand nature is what we choose to project onto it. You can trace this right back to 1492, as the American environmentalist Donald Worcester recently pointed out. When Columbus sailed from Spain and made his discovery of indigenous lands, Europeans thought they'd found a way of escaping their own ecological limits. It appeared to the early settlers, if we could have the next slide, please, that the Western Hemisphere was some kind of second Earth. And there's the Mercator 1587 world map with the second Earth idea. And the dream was that Europeans had found some kind of limitless Eden, a partly wild, empty, seemingly unmanaged new world. And if we could look at the next slide and press play, you can see just how persistent this idea is in the Anglosphere. This is Earth 2. And I'll let them tell you what it is. So you could see that this desire to remake the world and have limitless ecological potential, it's very deep inside us. And maybe we should all get together and buy Dublin and rewild it. And maybe that's the answer. But maybe you could forgive settlers when they first came to the New World for falling for that illusion that they had limitless resources available to them. After all, it would take over 500 years for there to be more people living in the New World per square mile than were living per square mile in Europe prior to Columbus's voyages. Aside from the wealth of colonizable space, the New World also offered a seemingly infinite cornucopia of resources: precious metals, food, wood. In stark contrast, hunger and ongoing access to quality woods were dynamic and significant issues across Europe. As indigenous lands were progressively colonized, the bounty extracted created a feedback loop that fed Europe's children, who in turn emigrated to the New World to benefit from the dividend as it continued to be realized from colonization. This dividend was, in essence, a giant swathe of fertile soil, vast, useful, diverse forests, bodies of water that teemed with fish and game, nearly every mineral then known to exist, as well as, or so it seemed, unlimited fresh water, at least until settlers reached the deserts of the West. Now, key elements of Christian thought and expansionist ideology aided this bonanza approach to settlement. If we could have our next slide, please. And there's bonanza, which some of you of a certain age might have grown up with on TV in Ireland. And I actually know of a Ponderosa Ranch in Ireland as well. And that's the ranch of these lads from the Bonanza TV show. Whereas indigenous traditions spoke of interconnected kinship relationships with inanimate and animate entities and versions of a great spirit or great mystery embodying the life forces of nature, European and Euro-American Christian traditions imagined humans to be the only species on Earth that had been created in the image of an omniscient God. Furthermore, God had awarded humans complete sovereignty over the planet, according to Christian thinking, and everything living upon it. Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth, said the Bible. So it's not a kinship relationship. It's a superior-inferior resources approach. Now, this point was made brilliantly by the American historian Lynn White in a 1968 very influential essay that's subsequently been criticized, and there's been talk of the Christian stewardship idea and so on. But it is still the case that that idea that the indigenous world was underutilizing God's bounty, that justified a lot of westward expansion. The European belief that a failure to improve land and exploit its soil justified forceful removal of indigenous populations. You can trace that right back to 1516 and the satire Utopia by the English philosopher and Catholic saint Sir Thomas More. And this expansionist ideology that America was historically unique and it had a destiny to grow and keep growing, that's very, very important in American history across time. Jefferson in 1801 tried the U.S. as chosen country for our descent. Lincoln is an almost chosen people. Reagan evoked vision. Exceptionalism Hello, can anyone hear me? Are we back?
Joy, we lost you for a minute there.
I'm not sure who could hear who, but probably we lost about a minute, I would say. Oh, hang on.
Oh, now is it you or is it my end that we have a problem? Because you're coming through slightly in waves to me. Let me see. I'll try go. Is that better?
Seems...
How's that?
That sounds a bit clearer, Joy.
That's good. I can hear you perfectly.
Great.
Can't hear Michael.
Well, that's okay.
No, you can't. You can't? Okay.
No, we got everyone back, or is it me that you lost, or what
I think we
happened?
did lose you for a minute there, Joy. It seemed to me that it was your connection that
My
faltered,
connection
but you
went.
are back.
Are we okay? Shall I resume?
Yes, please.
We've got time. Great. Anyway, I was talking about Donald Trump, who hexed the whole thing there somehow. I don't know how. He talked about America as a chosen land, and that you can see a direct Puritan idea of a howling wilderness versus a chosen land in some of his thinking. It is true, however, that conservation of the wild is connected to America. Mid-19th century, first significant American elite voice started to create an intellectual debate about preserving or conserving the American environment. George Marsh, author of Man and Nature in 1864. And in this period, to the abiding credit of the United States, it led the world in the protection of landscape and resources and the preservation of forests and watersheds. World's first, depends how you look at it, but let's say the world's first national park began in 1872 with Yellowstone, a 3,500 square mile area, mostly in Wyoming. Overall, the idea of setting aside areas of outstanding natural beauty was, as Wallace Stegner once pointed out, the best idea America ever had. And it telegraphed democratic ideals as a message to the world from the United States. If we could have the next slide, please. However, it's worth bearing in mind that America's national park lands have always been contested spaces into which Indigenous peoples have primary claims. After 1850, the most conventionally beautiful and sacred parts of what had been known as Indian country, so I'm talking Yosemite, Yellowstone, Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, Mesa Verde, Olympic, Grand Canyon, Glacier, Rocky Mountain, they were all designated wilderness and their Indigenous populations removed. And I think that history is not considered enough. National parks, if we could have the next slide, please, were undoubtedly a really good thing. But the setting aside for conservation of some of the most beautiful parts of North America didn't stop the US from despoiling and polluting the United States. In fact, the two phenomena may be linked. Holding collectively to the fantasy that parks are wholly pristine sanctuaries, somehow devoid of human impact, psychologically works to collectively permit the exploitation and pollution of nature everywhere else. When we compartmentalize right relationship with the wild to spaces inside parks, it helps sanction much wider environmental imbalances outside of parks. So I compared this to parks functioning the same way churches do for Sunday morning Christians. They're sites where those who want to confine their environmentalism to designated spaces can do so and spend the rest of their time, as William Cronin puts it, evading responsibility for the lives they're actually living. Now, the impact nationally in the United States of this kind of self-soothing psychology is really easily discerned. America embraced conservation politically at the same time that it turbocharged its shift towards industrialization and the wholesale exploitation of resources, including the damming of rivers and waterways, so as to put water for agriculture more fully under human control. As the nation shifted to using coal instead of wood and greatly expanded its steel industry, its planning became consistently geared towards maximizing growth via the use of resources outside of national park lands. The result, transformation of the West and exceptional population growth, plus significant soil erosion, depletion of rivers, aquifers, drought, and pollution. If we could have the next slide, please. But things really get bad in terms of environmental stress during the space age from the 1950s. It's called within environmental thinking the Great Acceleration. And the 50s see this broad shift towards the use of oil instead of coal, the rise of plastics, and it also marks the onset of what's known as the Green Revolution, which doubled the use of man-made fertilizer and entrenched an associated reliance upon disease-prone, high-yield crop varieties and pesticides. Now, a primary commitment to growth remains the dominant social paradigm within the United States, and in many ways, it's foundational to the American way of being. Reagan said in 1980, "We believe then and now there are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams." But in truth, much suggests that that period from 1870 to 1970, what Robert J. Gordon has called the special century, was actually a historically unique time of invention and multidimensional growth that just can't be matched again without some kind of exceptional scientific breakthrough. Levels of unprecedented growth that characterize the special century, or any sustained perpetual significant growth of any kind, require truly spectacular American research innovation that you can't gainsay, you can't guarantee that it will happen. Bear in mind, if you could have the next slide, that part of what swept Donald Trump to power in 2017 was a backlash against what was perceived as an anti-growth environmental standards agenda associated with the Obama administration. The two major impulses that fueled President Trump's rise to power were a top-down urge to access resources on the 28% of American land that was then federally owned, and a bottom-up push for restoration of blue-collar jobs linked to extractive industries such as coal, oil, and gas. It's really interesting, and you can see it at the bottom of this slide, that when President Trump called his people to mass at the Capitol building, he urged them, "Be there, it will be wild." And I think it's telling in a way. One last little point I want to make is that the word and the concept wild are very much rooted in the Anglosphere. The next century may very well turn out to be a Chinese century. And it's worth bearing in mind that Chinese traditions, along with so many others on the globe, do not have words that directly translate as wilderness. Although Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism all share the idea that all life forms are interdependent, interrelated, interactive. For some Chinese, the idea of wilderness is associated negatively with the great northern wilderness, that's the northeastern corner of China, where dissidents and youths were sent to farm wetlands in very harsh conditions in the mid-20th century. It's worth bearing in mind just how American the idea of the wild is. So let's discuss for a moment how the Indigenous world is deemed to fit into all of this discussion of the wild and stresses on the wild, because the Indigenous world is at the crunch point in the 21st century for many of these big ethical decisions. If we could have the next slide, please. There is hope. This is Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Interior of the United States right now. She's in charge of a lot of federal land, and she is a Laguna Pueblo, an Indigenous woman, and she's part of a rise of Indigenous female power that's marked the beginning of this century. Now, globally, Indigenous people own, occupy, or use a quarter of the world's surface area, and they safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Go to the next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have time to go into this slide very much, but on your left, the bit with the circles, that's how Indigenous people are envisioned to fit into fixing some of the world's environmental problems. And on the right is what I think really are the solution sets that are coming from the Indigenous world. Maybe we can go into these later on, as we're kind of running out of time. If we can change to the next slide. Now, although there is a World Bank and other top-down elite lot of thinking about the Indigenous world solving environmental problems for the developed world, in fact, what this idea of new conservation has within it a number of paradoxes, not least its partnership with some of the world's largest mining and fossil fuel companies. For example, the US Foundation Conservation International is supported by Chevron, and it's found itself tarnished by Chevron's multi-billion-dollar lawsuit with Indigenous groups in Ecuador over oil spills that the company inherited when it merged with Texaco. What's known as the Amazon Chernobyl. Currently, there are 70 ongoing cases in 31 countries against Chevron. Is an example of this kind of conflict. And there's other examples I could go into, but essentially big conservation groups often choose tourism industry and corporations over the interests of Indigenous peoples, even when they promise free and informed consent. And bear in mind that according to the NGO Global Witness, at least 1,024 environmental and land activists were killed just between 2002 and 2014. Okay, so let's conclude. If we could have the next slide. Where then does the world stand in relation to either the idea of the wild or to the wilderness? And where should you as an individual or a community or a nation stand? Anthropogenic, human-caused climate change has essentially brought about the end of nature as something that exists independently of human agency. And the case for this was made very eloquently by Bill McKibben in his book, The End of Nature, in 1989. We have for some time been altering the global processes that define the environment. And McKibben says, we've deprived nature of its independence, and that's fatal to its meaning. Lots of the solution sets that have been put forward don't take enough account of the economic granularity of the problem, and in particular, the limited agency most of us feel in a world dominated by corporations that's ever more unequal. Also, they tend to ignore the reality of competitive international geopolitics. And within that, climate is just one factor as nation states compete for supremacy. That said, there are thinkers such as Gavin Van Horn and John Hausdorfer of Western Colorado University, who urge us to see and respect and grow wildness everywhere, in cities, everywhere we find it. And they define wildness as anything that's capable of self-renewal, whether it's tiny plant coming through the cracks in the concrete or anything like that. They've written a lovely book called Wildness in 2017. But this is complicated by all the stuff I began the lecture with, because a number of these technological phenomena, they too arguably will be able to self-renew, and they too will have selves of a sort. I think it's important, furthermore, that we recognize the beautiful ethical awareness of human and non-human kinship that the authors so value in that book, Wildness. The stuff that comes from exposure to the wild, that feeling of profound interconnectedness and an awareness of our ancestors in the wild, what's called a wildness of the mind. It connects us to deep time, and that's really beautiful. But as far as economists are concerned, that's just another thing to be measured and encompassed and brought into capitalism. So you'll find that there's lots of movements to redefine GDP and measure cultural capital and environmental capital, and lots of thinking like that that's happening. I argue that the economists need every single discipline to be part of this story. And American Studies has a unique role to play because we are interdisciplinary. Too often the economists, the solutions they come up with forget the elasticity of demand. If we're taxed for anti-green behavior, human beings just work around it. And if we replace fossil fuels with cleaner, greener energy, we just keep consuming as before. There's a recent new book called Supercharge Me, and it suggests that one way to get around this is to have extreme positive incentives for change. So do things like exempt electric vehicles completely from road tax and have their parking fees and let them in bus lanes, really scope it out how far you can take encouraging people to change. I think it is time that we updated our ideas of the wild in light of the Anthropocene. The Alaska Fish and Wildlife Service have done just this. They define the wild as characterized by freedom from the human intent to alter evolutionary processes. Wild areas are self-willed, free to adapt and evolve as they will in response to global scale anthropogenic factors. What I'm saying is that the wild in the romantic sense is extinct. The non-human world cannot now escape our impact, and we are left only to lust for what we once so feared, to lust for true wilderness. The wild of our imaginations is all about our desire to be free from control. And this was why the English once dubbed the Gaelic speakers in Ireland beyond the realm of English control, the wild Irish. As we embark upon an ever more intimately technologized world, we do well to remember Thoreau's less quoted insight about the dangers of men becoming the tools of their tools. To combat this, we must seek out unmediated experience and recognize that we are not actually in control, and certainly not in the cosmic sense. After all, in planetary terms, we are protected as a planet by a cocoon, the atmosphere, and it's just 69 miles from wherever you are and wherever I am until you get to the cold, silent dark of space. Personally, I am encouraged by any sort of rewilding that happens. And this is an example of one rewilding place in Burnfoot in County Donegal, close to where I was born. It's called Wild Ireland. And in many ways, it's a very, very fancy zoo. But it is reminding us of what Ireland was and could be. The 2019 report found that 85% of Ireland's habitats had unfavorable conservation status, and almost half of Ireland's habitats were in decline. At one time, 80% of Ireland was trees, now it's 1%, and 72% of all Ireland's land is farmland. Rewilding and a new balance, I think, must be part of all our futures. And I'll finish there. Thank you so much.
Wow. Oh my goodness, Joy, though I'm almost lost for words. I'm very moved by that talk, and I thought it was amazing. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's just vital research, and it's something we all needed to hear. And we all need to integrate into, I think we need to integrate into our own research and teaching and lives. I have, oh my goodness, I have a lot of questions, but I am pretty sure other people do too. So I might just, just ask if anyone would like to ask a question, give a couple of seconds to see if someone would like to put their hand up. Otherwise, we can, I'll start, Joy. Okay, from the plethora of questions that I have, I maybe just go with this one first. So when you were showing us those rather unnerving robots and certainly terrifying slaughter bots, you mentioned a little while afterwards that AI, you said AI will profoundly impact how we see the wild. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about how you think it will impact how we see the wild, how artificial intelligence will continue to impact how we see wilderness and wildness, practically and conceptually, I think, as we move further into the 21st century.
I don't know the future, but I am concerned about our grip on reality as conventionally defined. And if any of you have children, you'll realize how very addictive and impactful this great experiment that we've been embarking on, where we are allowing ourselves to lose ourselves in the digital world. And, parents are always trying to claw our kids away from the digital world, but it is so seductive, so much. And trying to comprehend algorithmic change where it reads what you do and then builds that into the next iteration of your experience. That exponential change where something gets better and better and better and better is highly addictive. And I personally, I'm not sure that I'll be able to avoid being entirely seduced by the metaverse, by the fantasy that I can create another world where and digitally detach from the reality of an Earth that's becoming phenomenally unequal. The number of super trillionaires going to space or billionaires going to space is evidence of that inequality. And it's a concern. There was a film came out a couple of years ago called Ready Player One.
Oh yeah, I was just about to mention that actually.
Very prophetic, and my kid was going, "You gotta see this, Mom." It's not exactly that enjoyable a film, but the concept is telling. And it does make you look at all the existing literature about wilderness and wilderness thinking and find it almost quaint.
I think what you said about, I think one of the last things you said about our sort of romantic conceptualization of the wild as is extinct, almost brought me to tears because I realized how accurate that statement was, and I hadn't heard anyone say it in such stark terms, and use the language of ecology as well, with extinction, to talk about the romantic sense of the wild as something that is extinct. That was, yeah, that's going to stay with me, Joy. Okay, during the conference today, we had a number of kind of discussions about the sort of difference between wildness and wilderness. And, I think, and also in my own research, and I look at poetry by Indigenous Americans who are sort of returning to the land and thinking about the lands in lines similar to what you were outlining, kinship. I explore kinship quite a lot, and reciprocity in my own work. And you touched on that, the connection between Western environmental narratives and colonialism and patriarchal colonialism, and how actually kind of rewilding in the US was sort of led by that sort of Euro-American kind of patriarchal colonial kind of enterprise, if you like, where scholars are now coming out against some of the imaginary behind this and saying, well, it acts as a vehicle for the exclusion and erasure of Indigenous people and their histories on from the land. So would you be able to speak more about the connections between wildness and wilderness and colonialism?
Just before I say that, I just wanted to make the point about the reason why this is so emotional for us. And I think it's to do with the decline of magic, to do with this idea that, I mean that in the Keith Thomas sense, it's to do with the decline of a spiritual worldview. And I think for many of us, even if we haven't articulated it, the idea of mountains, the idea that there is somewhere out there that's pristine, that is truly wild, is somehow sustaining. And when you actually recognize that we are now in a kind of post-wild wilderness era, and that process are all going to accelerate through synthetic biology in particular, there is a sense of tristesse, of trauma, of grief that's aside from the decline in biodiversity. And I think it behoves us to think about it more and talk about it more and articulate that this has impacts beyond the biologists, and it shouldn't be owned just by certain disciplines. It should be talked about across the interdisciplinary spectrum. So you wanted me to speak about the difference between wild wilderness and colonialism. I suppose wildness is discrete from the idea of wilderness, because wilderness is linked to the Wilderness Act, which is very much that dichotomy. Wilderness is where man is not. But the idea of the wild is more of an idea of something that's self-directional, that's truly free and self-sustaining and can grow itself and control itself as an entity. And colonialism, the scholars that have been criticizing over the last 10 to 15 years have been imbricating critiques of wilderness with colonialism and have been suggesting that the two are intertwined. So that is a hopeful thing. If we cleanse ourselves from the romantic ideas of wilderness and see it as imbricated with the setting up of, because conservation as a word isn't that far from reservation, is it? It's making a space for what you imagine rather than what's, reservations were imagined as spaces where assimilation would happen, and that hasn't worked, has it? Indigenous people are transcending that narrative from that time. So it may be that it's a good thing that we're cleansing ourselves of ideas of wilderness that were hand in hand with expansion and with colonialism, but how we think about the wild, or what the space is for the wild, in this new 21st century is yet to be worked out. And it's very, I think, difficult. It's difficult even to know how we're going to relate to the middle ways, the gardens, the zoos, the managed spaces versus the completely fictionalized, perfect metaverse world. I think these are choices that we have to make collectively and also as individuals. And I have to be honest, I don't have the answers. And I can see that for future generations, it's going to be an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. Thanks, Joy. Please, if anyone has any questions for Joy, well, no matter how sort of broad or detailed, please feel free to put up your hand. Okay, so okay, so Michael and then Pat and then Thomas.
Thanks very much, Joy. Really, you said you were going to scare us, and I think you succeeded. And if ever, just that whole kind of thing where it's instead of, we find it so much easier to ignore catastrophe rather than to avert it. And I think it's striking, even some of the recent examples of things where you would think people would get mobilized. And you made reference to Chevron, and particularly thinking about the Stephen Donziger case that's going on in the US at the minute, where, you know, the lawyer has been under house arrest for representing Ecuadorian groups. But even the problem with that story seems to me that it's turned increasingly, even with people who are sympathetic to the predicament or whatever's going on, they've turned it into a story more about the abuse of legal practice and jurisprudence in the United States. And while those are legitimate concerns, we get further and further away from what actually has already happened in Ecuador and what continues to happen in Ecuador. And it seems to me that's sort of representative of the perceptual problem that we have, that the real catastrophe is we're still keeping it at arm's length, because I think we get ourselves excited about the legal problem because we think that's something somebody might be able to expedite. Do you think that's kind of representative of what happens more broadly?
I think that's a brilliant point. And I think the processes of denial are myriad for us all. These are large existential problems that it's vital we don't panic, but at the same time, we need to intellectually address, and our young people need to address, and we need to vote according to what we think is right. I think, though, that it's a problem when we see the environment as discrete from big issues like geopolitics or the power of corporations. I think, you know, you can look at the legal case and talk about sovereignty and rights agenda and so on. But there are big factors here at play to do with the growth of inequality. That graph, that Gini coefficient, has gone through the roof in the last 50 years in particular. I think these are what they call wicked problems, where they're all at the interstice of multiple circles. And I think it's dangerous to look at environmental issues just on their own. We need to see them in terms of larger factors and have empathy. You know, we were talking earlier, and members of my own family work on discovering oil, and from their perspective, it makes perfect sense, and they feel they're doing the world a favor by supplying necessary fossil fuel. You know, I think it behoves us to look at this in a multi-dimensional way.
You're asking us to imagine Ireland without farms as well, which is kind of an interesting perception.
Did I say anything more shocking?
Not quite.
Bears and wolves and lynxes and woolly mammoths.
Yeah, now we're talking. I'll let somebody else in to speak, Joy. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. I see Pat's hand is down now, so.
That was only because you heard me.
Yes.
Oh, you saw it. Okay. Joy, that was stunning, staggering, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm an interloper. I'm not an Americanist. I've kind of zoomed in from early modernity. I'm a colleague of Catherine's. And I just wonder, I mean, you talked about quaintness, the quaintness of our view of nature and the tristesse. I mean, just imagine the tristesse of somebody who's a literary historian who deals in the past, because there is that sense, you know, you really mobilize us. And I feel like we should be going out and doing something now, immediately afterwards. So the question I want to ask you really is about what is the, you know, it's kind of like a confessional thing almost. What is the point of doing historical research? What is the point of recovering the origins of this terrible trajectory that we're on? In the sense that, you know, that we can see it happening, we can watch it happening, but it's a car crash that we just keep watching in real time, time after time. And you would like to think that we could kind of give a message to the present by understanding how the past has brought us to this pass. But I do think that there's also a terrible tristesse about the quaintness of our enterprise.
The way I deal with this is I think of myself in deep time. And this is a lesson that various Indigenous people also pass on, that seeing yourself in terms of your ancestors is a very heartening thing to do. You are the product of your ancestors. And there is this long history of people who've survived and struggled. And, you know, if you're Irish, they've probably fought the land really hard and don't see it in romantic terms at all. They've really hard-wrung survival has allowed people to be alive today. But I think the value of literary history that you're doing and history at all is that it allows you to see yourself as the product of ancestors in the past, and also think of yourself as a potential good ancestor for the people who come after you. The Haudenosaunee talk about the unborn faces, thinking about the unborn faces of the future. And if you see yourself as part of a story that you don't know the ending of, because we don't, we can do our best, we can analyze, we can think, we can measure, God knows we measure, but we don't actually know the end of this story. All we can choose is to make the best choices we can at our point in that ancestor trajectory. And for me, that's how I cope with it, but everyone will have their own answer. But I also really believe that academics have been too stuck in respect for our intellectual ancestors and pleasing people who wrote in the last 40 years. And we need to be more problem orientated and bring our knowledge into solving the problems of the future.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you so much. That was an inspiring answer. Thank you. I think we have time for, I think, maybe one more question, and that's from Thomas.
Hi, Joy. That was really, really fascinating. My question was mostly about the Earth 2 thing that you had mentioned. And I thought it was interesting that you brought that up, because it is a blockchain project. And like you noted, you know, they take up so much energy and they're just dreadful for the environment in general. But one of the big draws for these things, and one of the reasons that they get so much interest online, is because a lot of fringe groups see NFTs and this kind of metaverse, along with stuff like Ethereum or whatever. They see all of this as representing a new Wild West, because it's, you know, decentralized and non-government regulated. And I was just wondering what you think about that particular choice of words that I see on the internet all the time, where people see it as this Wild West utopia, where people are free to deal as they wish. I just want to know what you think of that language of co-opting that term Wild West in terms of online.
I think that's a brilliant comment, and it gels strongly with what Pat Palmer just said, because we are replicating the past, aren't we? We've learned nothing really. We're just trying to relive the 19th century in some kind of 21st century fantasy, which is very sad, because we've been sold this idea of freedom, of growth without limits, and it's a profoundly individual idea as well. It isn't about community. That's why I think the rewilding movement, which is often embedded within communities, could be a solution, because it's piece by piece. Do you know what I mean? You rewild bit by bit, and it needs a sustaining community around it, and agreement and buy-in for that to happen. I don't really know what the impact of people losing themselves in these worlds is going to be. I honestly don't. I mean, I don't know how you feel. I mean, would you be happy to wear glasses where you were in what's called a mixed reality world, where there could be a giant unicorn beside you as an avatar that you can kind of see, that's smiling at you, but then there's also your mom making you a cup of tea? Apparently that mixed reality is going to be the next stage, rather than Earth 2, which is largely 2D as I understand it so far. I think the real challenge is going to be when that porous veil between the dimensions starts to tear. That for me is, I personally don't have the kind of brain that can handle that. I don't think. And I've tried VR stuff and it just freaks me right out. I don't find it enjoyable. I don't know. I knew there'd be 1,000 questions that I couldn't answer after this talk.
Oh, you're doing wonderfully. Seriously, it's such a capacious and emotional, as you say, topic. And
can I ask Thomas if he would go on Earth 2? I mean, how do you, what's your answer to your own question? You're one of the younger people here. I mean, how do you feel?
I mean, I don't really have an answer. I was hoping to find some guidance from you. Generally speaking, like, I find the actual idea of the metaverse, I find it a bit silly in a lot of ways, because in my experience with VR, it's very underwhelming, because the input commands are always going to feel artificial. So if you want to walk around and you're wearing this big headset, there's a few different options for motion. Like, you could use keys as if you're playing a video game, WASD or an analog stick, or what seems to be the popular one, which is actually walking around on some form of treadmill or whatever. And all of this is, again, it's just, there's so much endless periphery, and all of it serves to me to break down any illusion of reality in the metaverse. And on top of that, the way the metaverse has been advertised and communicated on a broad level so far has been so thoroughly unappealing. Even the art style that you showed us there of the, the Facebook dream of all the people with bobbleheads, it looks pretty grotesque. Like, everything looks really hideous.
Right.
It feels to me like corporate art, it's unappealing to me.
Corporate art, that's a great way of describing it. Corporate art. Of course, it won't always be that cumbersome, and the haptics will get better, where you can feel things and it will get tiny, absolutely tiny, the way, phones used to be enormous, and now they're relatively small. We're at the beginning of something.
Thanks, Thomas. And thanks, Joy. I do know we're a little over time. I know we started late. So if no one else has a question for Joy, I mean, I know we all do, but Joy, we are still recording this. We will upload this on our IAAS channel. And Joy, of course, we will send you the recording as well. And we will provide on our website, actually, the various links to your projects and the treated spaces. So if no one else has any further comments or questions, I'd just like to, would you please join me in thanking Joy one more time? Thank you. So a lot of,
thank you very much. Appreciate it.
it was
lovely to meet you all. Really great.
You too. Okay, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you to conclude.
Other than to say thank you to Joy one more time and hopefully see you in person in the future. I will exhort you all to go and have a drink, but make sure you have some dinner with it. We want to keep everybody healthy, we want to keep everybody fit, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. We have another day full of delights, including a paper by Thomas Caffrey, Thoreau star of the academic star of the future. And all in all, it's been a wonderful day. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It couldn't have been more generative, to borrow Catherine's very useful term. And I think it will continue to be so. And we've had a phenomenal evening with so much to think about. And in fact, I would also say we've now got so much to do. Thank you, everybody. Good night and good health. And to quote Dave Allen, may your God go with you. That's a vintage joke, Joy.
Vintage, love it.
All right, take care.
Bye.
See you. Bye. I'll stop recording. No.